everyone, this is Pico Entertainment and we are back again, and here now we have another video for you, and this will be my full-on review and coverage of the first season of A Knight of Seven Kingdoms. Now there may be spoilers here for all episodes throughout the series, and also other episodes within both House of the Dragon and also Game of Thrones, so just beware when going into this overall video. So when we talk of the Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, it is the second spin-off series of the very famous Game of Thrones franchise, of course based off the original show which debuted way back now in 2010, based off the series of fantasy novels A Song of Ice and Fire created by author George R.R. Martin. Now House of the Dragon was the prequel series which focused on the Targaryen dynasty, and that will be heading into its third season later on this year. But A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms is focused on a much more smaller story, adapting a series of novels, much more smaller in scale, titled The Tales of Dunk and Egg. In terms of the timeline of the Game of Thrones world, A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms takes place around 70 or 80 years after the events of House of the Dragon, and 80 to 90 years or so before the events of Game of Thrones. The story itself focuses on a knight known as Sir Duncan, or Dunk the Tall, who we see in the beginning of the series burying his master before travelling to a tournament in Ashford. He attends certain parties at certain inns before coming across a bold child named Egg, and they form together a bond, and he later employs him as his squire. We then see him taking part in several tournaments, or getting to know the participants within several tournaments, as he looks to define his purpose in life. And we later on go on to discover that Egg has far more status and importance within the world that they are involved in. Now, if that sounds like an abridged version to anybody who supports this show, then I'm sorry to say that is near enough what we have here. As Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, for me personally, has been nothing more than a placeholder to fill the void between the Season 2 and Season 3 releases of House of the Dragon that was covering over 2 years. Normally these shows tend to be around a year or 18 months in release, but we know there were certain delays within House of the Dragon. And I honestly feel that Knight of the Seven Kingdoms overall as a show really wasn't about nothing at all in terms of significance. It didn't really have anything purposeful or anything meaningful or compelling truly for me as an overall story, both as an individual piece of television series, but also within the Game of Thrones storyline and franchise itself. It wasn't that it was a particularly bad show in terms of the production. As I've always mentioned when talking about these shows set within the Game of Thrones franchise, the production values are always very high. The acting and the performances and the musical score are always of an elite standard, and that's why all of these shows within the Game of Thrones franchises are always deemed to be at a certain level prestige television whenever they are released. But my big issue with A Knight of Seven Kingdoms is that it just wasn't much of a story. If we look at the overall events of what actually happens, as what I've previously described, it really is a show that probably could have taken place over around just over an hour, as opposed to the 6 episodes that we got consisting of a runtime of around 30 minutes each, and that's probably a bit shorter when you include the end credit titles. Now I absolutely understand that at the concept this was dealing with a much more smaller scale story. It is much more of a character study involving Sir Duncan and his striving for his self-purpose. So I fully understood going in that you were not going to see the same weight and scale and epic battles and dragon warfare as what we saw with both Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon. Not every show can have that elite scale, and also it can be refreshing at times to see an entry within the franchise take a different direction. But at the same time, regardless of how high or how low the scales are, you still need a story that has a certain movement and momentum and purpose, and there was nothing really here that I could really see in terms of A Knight of Seven Kingdoms. For the most part, it's largely uneventful and I would say a bit boring, particularly when we look at the first 4 episodes where again nothing really happens in terms of the overall plot. Perhaps the 2 most significant parts of the overall series was the revelation of Egg being a member of the Targaryen dynasty, and also of course the most standout moment or standout episode within the entire series was episode 5, where we actually got to the actual tournament itself. And despite being interrupted by a needless extended flashback where we see Duncan referring back to his younger days, how he came to be introduced to his master to begin with, we then had a very visceral and very intense combat sequence involving the tournament fight. But that wasn't enough to sustain the interest, or certainly inject a huge amount of interest in the story. When we came to the overall finale, things kind of petered out in typical Game of Thrones fashion, where the penultimate episode tends to be the one that goes all out in terms of action and spectacle, before we kind of get much more of a middling prologue to close the season out. But again, we just didn't have enough here in terms of real substance to really justify, for me personally, this show actually existed. And as with so many shows now, in terms of television and media entertainment, they feel less like full-on television series and more like movies that were pitched and for some reason rejected. So they've been really stretched out and chopped up into little segments in order to put forward as a piece of streaming content and masquerade much more as a season of television. And as we closed out the overall season, where we see Duncan and Egg going on their further adventures together, I would actually entertain that this whole series really could have been summed up in about 2 or 3 episodes. So nothing special here, nothing spectacular for me, and definitely something that's not very essential. And I will have to comment on the overall coverage of the show, particularly when you look at social media and all of the Rotten Tomatoes and critic scores. The main reactions being that A Night of 7 Kingdoms is far superior to The House of the Dragon, and even perhaps eclipsing some of the best episodes of Game of Thrones. Now, whilst everybody is open and entitled to their opinion, I completely disagree with that statement. If you go over some of the best episodes of indeed Game of Thrones, whether it was the Battle of Blackwater or indeed Hardhome or the finale of season 6, or most definitely a lot of the episodes of the first season of House of the Dragon, and especially season 2 with the Battle of Rooks, where we had that amazing dragon battle between 3 dragons overall, I believe. When you actually go back and review those episodes, I think you would realise that there is absolutely nothing within A Night of 7 Kingdoms that comes anywhere close to matching the standard in terms of the action and the drama and the spectacle and the overall excitement and intensity that any of those episodes had. And I do think it's much more of the fact that we are only in February and already it seems we are very much starved of any high quality in terms of both movies and entertainment in general. If you look at it so far, we haven't really had any outstanding films so far. Or indeed, when we look at television, if we really think about it, the only really competition that is facing The Night of 7 Kingdoms so far in terms of mainstream traction and conversation is of course Starfleet Academy, and I think we could all agree that A Night of the 7 Kingdoms is far better than that. But just because we have low competition, it doesn't necessarily mean that this can warrant as a truly great piece of series. And I just think we are seeing large levels of overhype and overratedness here in terms of this show, which again wasn't the most terrible show ever, but at the same time it just wasn't very significant, very uneventful, and for large parts very boring and overall very meandering. And still to this day I couldn't really see any justification for it other than being a placeholder to fill the void for the releases between second and third seasons of House of the Dragon. And sadly, A Night of the 7 Kingdoms for me, aside from a very intense 5th episode, proved to be nothing more than that. So those are overall thoughts and feelings on the first season of A Night of 7 Kingdoms. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you have any other further movies, television series, or any other topics within the pop entertainment and culture scene that you'd like to see me cover within the channel, then also let me know within the comments, and I will see if I can provide further commentary for you on that subject matter within the future. Please also hit like the subscription and notification buttons so I can provide you with more high quality content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, and I will see you very, very soon.